I came across a cult called the Finders. U.S. Customs agent was Ramon Martinez. A search warrant against the Finders put all the children in protective custody, and they arrested the 2 adult Finders. 2 of the kids that showed signs of sexual abuse. They had this elaborate computer system. We're talking 1987. And the authorities really tried to destroy her by putting her in solitary for 2 years.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the Franklin scandal?
So in 2002, I was talking to an editor at a magazine, and he said, pitch me dark stories. And I said, well, you know, how dark do you want? And he goes, dark, dark.
Great.
So, you know, I kind of threw my hands up and I said, Nazi Satanists. I mean, what? And then that glint in his eye, Satanists. So I had a simple plan. And whenever anybody says they have a simple plan, you know it's going to get convoluted. I had a simple plan. I was going to find some Satanists. I never really interacted with them before, but I figured, you know, I'd find them. And I go to a blank mass, write an article, and then that would be it. It would be a kind of a slam dunk. Actually, a pretty easy assignment as far as assignments go. And I came across, when you're writing on a particular subject, you're always looking at least I am, and most writers that I know are looking at tangential stories or stories that might be related, whether it's aeronautics or scuba diving. Most writers I know are looking at different tangents. And I came across a cult called the Finders that was seemingly doing very bad things to children. There were 2 Finders that were busted in a Tallahassee park with 6 children, and the children were ragamuffins. And a concerned citizen had called the Tallahassee Police Department, and the Tallahassee Police Department took one look at them, and they put all the children in protective custody, and they arrested the 2 adult Finders. And a doctor, and then I got this U.S. Customs report on that. And the U.S. Customs agent was Ramon Martinez. And then they executed a search warrant against the Finders. And I should say, in the interim, a physician that worked for the Tallahassee Police Department said that 2 of the kids had showed signs of sexual abuse. So the U.S. Customs served a search warrant on the warehouses of the Finders, and they found all kinds of, I mean, there was like child pornography, and there was also the Finders people would put want ads into the newspaper for babysitters, and the Finders would go and do recon on those families that needed babysitters. And there was a telex about the Finders purchasing 2 children in Hong Kong. I mean, and they had this elaborate computer system. We're talking 1987. And Ramon Martinez, they collected all this evidence, but then he didn't hear about the Finders investigation. So he went to the D.C. police, they executed the search warrant together. And the D.C. police told Martinez that the Finders had become a CIA internal matter and there will be no more investigation. And that kind of fried me right there. I mean, I kind of thought I knew how the world worked, but that one document just ultimately, it changed the entire trajectory of my life. I was thinking to myself, what have I missed in my life? What paradigm have I missed? Because I could not find any sensible reason for why the CIA would quash an investigation into a very strange cult that was seemingly doing very bad things to children. And that started my odyssey looking for these types of networks.
Which, and this will tie into what I want to talk to you about afterwards, leads into your reporting about Jeffrey Epstein. So if you could hit the wave tops on that, and then I want to jump to something that probably a lot of people would recognize from some modern news clippings.
Well, I ended up spending 7 years looking at a trafficking network whose epicenter was Omaha, Nebraska. And they were flying kids all around the country. And there was a house in D.C. wired for audiovisual blackmail that was owned by a CIA asset named Craig Spence. And once I realized that that story was real, that it had legs, I had to do it. I had to. And I spent 7 years working on that story. And it was troubling because I could not get anybody in the mainstream to touch that story. No one. And I actually estranged a number of editors because it's kind of interesting. There was cognitive dissonance. I would tell these editors, and at this point, I knew a lot of editors in New York. I'd tell these editors about the story about the network that was centered in Omaha. And there would be two things going on in their head. And I could almost see the wheels going around. They would say, this is a horrible story. We need to help Nick Bryant, or we can just write Nick Bryant off as crazy, and I can go home tonight and have dinner with my family, and there won't be any more problems. So the vast majority of people in publishing took the latter route, and I knew that it was a story that seemed beyond the pale. So I wrote a 100-page book proposal, just showing all the stuff that I had. And the agent that was representing me, and it was a big agency, they just immediately dumped me. Within 2 weeks, I was unceremoniously dumped. And then I got another agent who was a gutsy guy, and he sold a lot of stuff that was far from the beaten trail or beaten path, and he tried to sell it, and he couldn't sell it. And that was very frustrating because at a certain point I acquired, there were grand juries that were used to cover up this network. There were 3 grand juries. And I don't know if your listeners or viewers are familiar with how a grand jury works, but grand juries are notorious for being corrupted. A special prosecutor is chosen for a grand jury. And then grand jurors are just citizens that have shown up for jury duty, and they've been funneled into a grand jury. And the special prosecutor calls the witnesses, and he shows the grand jurors the evidence. And there was a New York Supreme Court judge. He had a famous quip that special prosecutors of grand juries have so much power over grand jurors that they can get them to indict a ham sandwich. And that's what happened with this network, and that's what happened with Epstein. And that these grand juries were thoroughly corrupt. And actually, the Omaha, there were 2 actually grand juries in Nebraska. There was a Douglas County grand jury, and then there was a federal grand jury that said that there had been no child abuse. And they actually indicted 2 of the victims for perjury. And one of the girls, she was 20 years old at the time. She was indicted on 8 counts of perjury by the state grand jury and 8 counts of perjury by the federal grand jury. And she said, I was abused, and I'm not going to say that I wasn't. And she was looking at 200 years. I mean, this kid who'd been trafficked as an adolescent, who somehow mustered the spiritual fortitude and strength to say, no, I'm not going to deny that. I was abused. And she was sentenced to between 9 and 15 years by a kangaroo court. And the authorities really tried to destroy her by putting her in solitary for 2 years.
That's an amazing story arc to go from somebody who is a victim that comes forward to then be putting in jail. I think most people, to include myself, would not want to think that the U.S. legal system was capable of doing something like that.
And this is a very special woman. Her name is Alicia Owen. And I founded an organization, a 501c3 called Epstein Justice, where we're seeking justice on behalf of the Epstein victims. And she is an associate director. She graduated from college cum laude, summa cum laude. I mean, just a remarkable individual. I mean, 1 in a billion, maybe.
Yeah.
That that can go through not only being raped by perpetrators as a kid, but then being raped by the Department of Justice and the FBI as a young adult.